Hi, I'm Aaron McLaren, the lead audio programmer at Epic Games working on the Unreal Audio engine. I've been working in games since 2007. I have experience in game audio from a number of perspectives: composition, sound design, and audio programming. When I joined Epic in 2015, I started development on a new multi-platform audio renderer. The goal was to establish platform parity with audio and serve as the basis for improving the audio engine in UE4. It's now on by default in 4.24 and has shipped on all platforms in Fortnite. Over the last few years, we've grown the audio engine team. We now have 8 audio programmers, a technical sound designer, and a producer. Here I've listed the team in the order of when they joined the team, left to right, top to bottom. And we're still hiring. We currently have an open position for an embedded technical QA analyst. This role would work directly with us on testing and developing new features and will play a huge role in shaping the future of audio in the Unreal Engine. I encourage you to check out our careers page if you're interested. I'd like to share some resources to help you learn about the Unreal Audio Engine. My team and I have given many talks and live streams through the years. We've been involved in most of Epic's tech demos and keynotes, many of which highlight audio. We've also recently partnered with some great game audio educators on a new audio-focused courseware series. We're rolling out updated docs on older features and publishing new docs on newer features. There are also many active community members who share their tutorials and projects through YouTube and GitHub. Many of us on the Audio Engine team are also active in helping people out on social media and forums, such as Facebook, Twitter, and various other forums. There are several sample projects which showcase audio implementation and technology. Notably, we recently reworked the Audio and Shooter game, UE4's most widely downloaded sample project. There's simply too many resources to post here on this one slide, so please check out the PDF that we put together in the resources section of Unreal Fest. Based on our efforts to develop learning resources and through years of dev support in the community, as well as based on countless conversations with novices and veterans alike, my team felt like a great topic for Unreal Fest Online would be something which gets more at fundamentals versus another deep dive on advanced next-gen features. Like any domain, fundamentals are key for establishing a foundation for innovation and quality. Furthermore, and perhaps more importantly, they provide a mental framework that optimizes the process of learning. New features are more easily understood, and processes are better clarified, and connections, even across disciplines, are more easily made. It's the key for mental clarity. Unfortunately, there isn't enough time in this talk to discuss all the fundamentals for game audio. That would fill a whole college course, if not a lifetime. Indeed, after organizing this talk, I realized I can only really get reasonably deep on a couple fundamental topics. I'll have to break other topics up into subsequent parts for future Unreal Fests. For this first talk on audio fundamentals, we felt a deep dive on the digital representation of audio in computers and the closer related topics of bit depth, noise, and dynamic range would be an excellent starting point. The digital audio fundamentals I will discuss in this and future parts underpin every aspect of game audio. It's not just the audio engine tech, but also sound design, audio implementation, and the development and acquisition of new quality source material. Before jumping in, I wanted to take a moment to underline 2 key motivations for this talk. One is that understanding digital audio fundamentals should be a basic expectation for anybody wanting to work in game audio. Over the last few years, as we've been staffing up for the audio engine team and the audio content team, we've discovered that many candidates, even those with years of experience, often lack a solid understanding of this material. There may be larger reasons as to why this is the case, but I'll leave that discussion for a different talk. Secondly, the game industry is filled with talented developers from other domains: graphics, animation, physics, gameplay, tech art, etc. However, those developers rarely know much about audio. Unless the developer is particularly humble and takes a moment to do some research, it can result in several outcomes: dismissal, overconfidence, or avoidance and fear. Dismissal can happen when a lack of domain knowledge is conflated with the idea that there's just not that much there. If I don't know about this domain, they might think, it must mean there's nothing there to know. However, an overconfident developer may think that their knowledge in other domains immediately applies to audio. While often there are indeed analogies, for example, audio is similar to graphics in many ways, there are often just as many differences. A confident and skilled programmer or tech artist jumping into audio without proper foundational knowledge can create a lot of problems: bugs, bad designs, and years of technical debt. Finally, a developer may assume audio is some arcane black magic discipline that only the truly brilliant can approach. After all, they reason, I'm an expert in X, Y, or Z, and there's tons of us. Audio must be really hard because there's just not that many audio programmers. This attitude may seem deferential and maybe result in a boon to audio programmer salaries, but it's probably the most dangerous of the attitudes long term, as it can impact game industry-wide attitudes to audio as a discipline, and usually leaves audio to third-party solutions. I have found in all of these cases that it actually doesn't take too long to walk through the fundamentals and clarify some core concepts. It's actually pretty easy to open up audio as something that is understandable and appreciable. It's really not a dark art. The scientific study of sound is acoustics. Sound that we perceive is almost always a longitudinal vibration, in other words, along a line, and almost always through air molecules. However, an excellent way to gather great source material for games is to use contact mics, which allow you to record sound through a variety of different materials. When air is the medium, air molecules hit each other like billiard balls to transfer the wave energy at roughly 343 meters per second at standard temperature and pressure. Getting deep into acoustics, though, is beyond the scope of what I want to talk about here, but it does serve as a backdrop to begin our discussion, and I would recommend developing a deeper understanding, as it's surprisingly useful in a number of ways when trying to realistically simulate sound in a 3D game world. What is relevant to this talk, however, is how we record those sound vibrations. Analog recording techniques, exactly as the name suggests, employs a mechanism that allows for the direct translation of the energy to create an analogous representation. For example, if you can cause those vibrations in the air to vibrate a needle and then drag that vibrating needle across something which can record that needle's position in time, for example, wax or plastic or magnetic tape, you've made an analog recording. Reproduction of that analog recording back into acoustical sound waves simply requires a reversal of the process. One key advantage of analog recording is that as long as you keep your analog signals within the material constraints of the recording media, you can capture a very high quality direct representation of the real sound all the way down to the smallest detail. One key disadvantage is precisely this dependency on the material itself. The material may respond imperfectly to the input signal and thus introduce noise. Noise is the part of a recording where no meaningful information is present. The ratio of the signal to noise, represented as the ratio of the power of the signal over the power of the noise, represents the general recording quality of the analog recording. You can think of it as the dynamic range of the sound relative to the volume of the noise floor, in other words, the power of the noise. A significant problem with noise is that it accumulates. Recording from one analog medium to another analog medium sums their noise while not necessarily summing their signal. Over time, the noise rises while the signal remains constant. Many people my age have experienced this with tape recorders and mixtapes. Making mixtapes of mixtapes and recording over the same thing over and over results in more and more of this hiss. The hiss is the noise floor I'm talking about. Finally, over time, the physical medium that analog recordings are stored on, like records and tapes and whatever, decay over time and over usage. You can literally wear out an analog record and by just listening to them too much. But why talk about analog at all? It serves as a reasonable comparison when we want to talk about digital audio. And there are many things about analog audio that are still relevant in sound design and in digital audio and game audio. Digital recording uses a different mechanism to record sound. Instead of making a mechanical energy transfer to a physical medium, it instead transfers the energy first to an electrical signal at a given voltage value. Then the voltage value is measured, in other words sampled, and then quantized to a digital number at regularly spaced intervals at a given sample rate. The electrical signal is technically still an analog signal, in other words, infinitely precise in time and amplitude. It's only when it's sampled and quantized, or digitized, that to fit into the range of a number that can be represented in a computer, that it becomes digital. The step of the process which quantizes the signal will be the focus of this first talk on fundamentals. The second step, which involves the rate at which we take new samples, will be the focus on the next future talk on fundamentals. The subject of digital signal processing, or DSP, which is a subdiscipline of electrical engineering, is entirely derived from these two aspects, and one could spend a lifetime studying their implications. But before digging deeper into digital audio sampling, I'd like to take a quick diversion to briefly explain how numbers work in computers. I found when talking with non-technical sound designers and other artists that although they know about binary and vaguely how they work, they don't quite grok it at a fundamental level. I've seen enough light bulbs go off that it's worth a quick diversion. To store numbers, computers use transistors, which are tiny little on-off switches. The name transistor is actually a portmanteau of transfer, which means on, and resistor, which means off. Of course, any Boolean state could be represented by an on or off, like up, down, left, right, yes, no, true, false. But if we treat the 0 and 1 states as a basis for counting, we can actually then represent all numbers just using transistors. Counting in binary works pretty much the same way as any other base. When we run out of digits, we just add a placeholder, for example, 0, and keep counting. For example, in base 10, instead of using the numbers 10, 11, and 12, we think of them as just reusing the same digits. The pattern is really obvious. So, for example, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, then you run out of digits and you just add a placeholder 0. So instead of 10, you say 1, 0, and then say 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, all the way up to 99. You run out of a digit, you add a placeholder, and you say 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 2, etc. for counting in 10. It's dead simple. With base 2, it's the same pattern. You just run out of digits a lot faster. So instead of saying 0, 1, 2, 3, you say 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, etc. You just basically, anytime you run out of a place, you just add another 0. For base 10, each placeholder is a power of 10. For base 2, each placeholder is a power of 2. That's true for any base, it turns out. So for computers, since we use powers of 2 or binary, that's why many numbers that we store in computers are powers of 2. They just fit nicely in the number of bits that you have available. Like why, say, for example, you're making a number that goes up to 1,000. Well, might as well just use those last 24 numbers, so you say 1,024, because it just fits nicely in a power of 2, which is taking full advantage of the bits that are available. The important point here is that by adding more bits, though, we add more placeholders, which then allow us to count up to higher and higher numbers. This is relevant for audio because we talk about bit depth, which is the number of bits used to store the sample of an audio signal. I'd like to underscore this last point. Analog representations of sound are continuous and technically infinite in precision. It's true that at some point, if you take into account quantum mechanics, you'll hit a physical limit on the nature of reality. Turns out reality is also quantized. That's what quantum mechanics is all about. But if you stay high enough in the classical mechanical domain, you can think of it as infinitely precise. But once we digitize the signal into the digital domain, our signal is no longer continuous, nor is it infinite. It's the opposite, discrete and finite. The important and relevant part for audio is that the more bits we use to represent a number, the more different numbers that we have that we can use for the representation. So as a function of the number of bits goes to infinity, the signal that we use to represent, or the digital signal that we use to represent the signal approaches an analog signal. Before going deeper into the consequences of digitization, I'd like to talk about loudness or volume perception. It turns out that our ears are nonlinear in their sensitivity to sound. Our ears have a massive dynamic range. The energy difference between the quietest sounds that we can perceive and the loudest sounds that we can perceive, that is at the point of pain, are many orders of magnitude. In fact, to hear something as perceptually double in volume is actually 10 times the power. So this power of 10 relationship is logarithmic. And because logarithmic nonlinear scales are super non-intuitive to humans, scientists invented a new scale called decibels, which takes this logarithmic nonlinearity into account. In essence, decibels are a ratio of the power of one measured quantity over the power of another reference quantity adjusted to a log 10 scale. It's a sort of more human-oriented representation of loudness. There are a number of different ways that you can use decibels in audio. There's two main ways that we use decibels in game audio. One is what we refer to as the sound pressure level, and then another one is by way of comparison to a unity gain reference value. I'll describe these in the next two slides. Sound pressure levels are calculated using a standard reference defined as the threshold of the limit of hearing. This threshold is derived from experimental tests on human subjects. Think of it as the sort of sound of a leaf or a pin drop hitting the ground. Obviously, it's going to be different depending on the person, and everyone has different levels of hearing ability. But that said, SPL levels are a fantastic tool for developing a basic intuition as to the relative volumes of various sound phenomena. So with 0 SPL being the threshold, it could be the sound of a leaf or the quietest whisper, just the barely detectable sound, while 60 SPL is the volume of a normal conversation that you might have in a room. 120 SPL would be the sound of a gun or a gunshot, which is great for gun games. 140 SPL might be the sound of a grenade. 180 to 200 SPL is the sound of basically plasma as the air breaks down and the air is unable to transmit sound anymore. So another way that audio uses decibels is to compare volume levels with what is called unity gain as a reference level. Unity gain is basically when the volume of a particular sound has no gain multiplier. In other words, its volume is multiplied by 1.0. It won't change the volume of a sound. It's technically not saying anything about the actual volume of the sound as perceived by your ears, but it is indicating a decibel comparison of volume scaling. So a decibel of 0 dB would indicate a delta from unity gain of 0, in other words, no volume change. Then reducing or amplifying from this unity value would be a plus or minus decibel change from unity gain. You might see in audio engine code in UE4 decibel units that are in the negatives, for example, negative 30 dB or negative 60 dB, etc. This just means that the volume scale from unity gain is that many decibels. Like, in other words, it will match the perception of nonlinear logarithmic volume scaling. An important result of this representation is that technically a 0.0 volume scale, in other words, pure silence after the gain multiplier, is negative infinity decibels. Usually, audio engines and other audio tools that you might use in a digital audio workstation simply clamp to 0 below some decibel threshold, for example, negative 60 or negative 90, etc. In this slide, I've taken a screenshot of a tool that I use for my home recording in my studio. And I thought it just had, it was a nice little UI that indicated sliders that show different decibel values. You see negative 45 dB on the left there, negative 18 dB in the middle, and on the right, I've got the slider all the way down to negative infinity dB. Obviously, that slider at some point just says, oh, it's low enough, it's negative infinity. And you notice at the top there, 0 is at the top, that's 0 dB. That basically just means unity gain. And most DAWs and other tools allow you to go a little bit above 0, but it's generally not a great idea to go above 0 dB when you're volume scaling. On an interesting side note on the topic of volume perception, I'd like to talk about the fact that there is in fact a frequency dependency to this. Just as different light frequencies have different sensitivities to the eye, so do different sound frequencies have different sensitivities to the ear. This diagram here, called a Fletcher-Munson curve, shows the equal loudness contours as a function of frequency, usually measured through a pure sine tone. Important to note here is that we're particularly sensitive to sounds around 6,000 kilohertz and less sensitive to sounds at lower frequencies. This has a number of interesting applications and consequences in game audio. For example, lower and higher frequency sounds will appear to drop off faster when distance attenuated. Similarly, if you apply a volume slider down, maybe for user preference, the lower sounds will apparently drop off faster than the higher frequency, than the sort of mid-frequency sounds. In UE4, you can kind of take advantage of this to get some more realistic distance modeling. In UE4, we have a feature in sound attenuation settings that allow you to apply a low-pass and a high-pass filter on sounds as a function of distance. Note that this effect also plays a role in analyzing a game's mix. Sounds with a lot of audio in the sensitive region of hearing will sound a little bit more loud than sounds in the less sensitive regions. Sound designers who are aware of this and take it into account will have be able to produce more controlled mixes and avoid certain issues of aural fatigue. Let's get back to the issue of bits and how that is relevant to how we represent sound in a computer. In audio, the number of bits used when creating a snapshot of acoustical sound is referred to as the bit depth. When you hear 8-bit or 16-bit audio, this is what we're talking about. I've listed in this slide the number of different amplitude values which are possible at various common bit depths and ranges for audio. These are simply just power of 2 values. So 2 to the 8 is 256, 2 to the 16 is 65K, etc. We can visualize this effect by comparing it to a quantized grayscale image. The image here shows the different bit depths for blending from white to black. With 1 bit, you see it just instantly goes from white to black instantly. You can barely just make out the visual difference between 8-bit and 16-bit lines. So what's the audible difference between 8-bit, 16, 24, and 32-bit audio? It's quantization noise. Quantization noise is fundamentally different from the analog noise that is present in analog signals. Although they do share some similar properties, they're not the same. The noise in analog recordings is due to various aspects of the limitations of physical media and is presented as an ever-present hiss. Usually it's pretty audibly perceptible. For digital signals, quantization noise is simply the difference between the real acoustical signal and the quantized output. The noise is nonlinear and really depends on the input signal. The more analog signal is truncated, or different from the quantized digital number, the more quantization error is present. And it sounds very different from analog noise. Assuming an ideal analog to digital conversion process and a uniform input signal, in other words, it's like evenly distributed across the different ranges that the analog signal could be. The signal to quantization noise ratio, or SQ/NR, is easily calculated as about 6.02 times the number of bits used to quantize the signal. There's some fancy math that you could use to look up what that is, but that's roughly the approximation that you can use to estimate what your quantization noise will be. So for 16-bit audio, the SQ/NR would be roughly 96.3 decibels. This is basically the dynamic range of the audio signal that you could represent with this number of bits, and the level of the volume against the level of the volume of the perceived quantization noise. Comparing back with our SPL chart, which again compares sounds to the different thresholds of hearing, about 100 dB is the sound of a motorcycle engine just a couple meters away. So 16-bit audio has enough SQ/NR to make quantization noise basically irrelevant for most applications. For 32-bit audio, which is the number of bits we use to mix audio in the Unreal Engine, has enough SQ/NR to represent the sound of Krakatoa, the world's largest recorded sound, before hearing any quantization noise. So that's roughly about 190 decibels. Interestingly, quantization error is not always undesired. It can create an interesting sounding distortion effect, and when applied in the right context, is pretty cool. In the Unreal Engine, we have a source effect, which you can actually apply to any sound, which allows you to dynamically decimate an audio signal's bit depth while a game's running according to whatever game parameter you want. It's actually just quantizing the audio signal intentionally versus actually reducing the bit depth of the sound. It's still rendering into 32-bit buffers, though it does serve as a great way to illustrate the sound of low-bit audio. Also, interestingly, you can get continuous bit depth representations with this effect. In other words, instead of quantizing to exactly 8 bits, you can have 8.2 bits. So you could hear what 8.2-bit audio would sound like. So I'll now play a video demonstration of using this bit crusher on the sound of Dan Reynolds, our technical sound designer, counting to 10.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Although 16 bits and 32 bits offer enough SQNR that usually you can ignore its effects, it can be a problem in audio when the audio signal is very quiet relative to the quantization noise. In other words, the signal in your SQNR is low. So one way to minimize this quantization error is to use a dithering algorithm. Most DAWs offer this as an option when you render your audio source. So dithering essentially uses a randomization algorithm when quantizing the signal versus directly truncating the signal when converting it to a digital representation. So when you add that noise, signals which would otherwise have significantly perceptible artifacts due to the quantization noise, they're all smoothed out. So dithering is a common technique in image processing to reduce the size of an image. In other words, you can use fewer bits to represent pixels. This image I have on the slide here shows a before and after image of a low bit image pre and post dithering. So dithering is particularly important in 8-bit audio, but it's less important with 16-bit audio and higher bit depths. Okay, so in UE4, when you import an audio asset, it internally converts the asset to 16 bits. Even if the asset you imported was 8 bits or 24 bits or any other number of bits. This is done primarily for historical reasons and issues around technical debt and backwards compatibility. However, there are compelling reasons to actually use 16 bits as the audio format for a game engine. One key thing is that 16 bits are easily and quickly decoded into 32-bit floats, which modern computers are optimized for different mathematical operations. Generally speaking, 32-bit numbers are optimized for CPU registers. So the Unreal Engine renders its audio in 32 bits as well, which, as we've seen, has a huge dynamic range and very minimal quantization error. If you were to use 24-bit audio as the representation, which is a common request in the Unreal Engine, which we do want to support in the future, but just explaining why 16 versus 24-bit audio is what the differences are. If we were to use 24-bit audio, converting that number to 32-bit float would involve more relatively expensive mathematical operations and doesn't really nicely align on CPU registers. And also, this shouldn't be understated, using 16-bit audio also takes up less memory than 24-bit audio. This is relevant because we actually need temporary memory to store all the decompressed audio from our real-time decoders. So when we get a compressed audio source, we have to decode it into uncompressed 16-bit audio. And if we were to store that into 24-bit audio, it would just take up a third more memory, which could add up pretty quickly, especially the more sound sources that we're rendering, etc. Given this new understanding of digital audio fundamentals, I'd like to apply this knowledge and suggest some recommendations for best practices. First, avoid using quiet sound sources that are then boosted in Engine or in your DAW during the sound design process. Although the absolute noise floor of your sound source may be low, what's important is the ratio of the signal to the noise floor. Sounds with low amplitude signals tend to require boosting to be audible in a complex game mix. And when a sound source is boosted, it not only boosts the signal, it boosts the noise. Secondly, avoid overdoing dynamics processing, in other words, compression, on sound sources. Compressing the dynamic range is all about reducing the volume of the loud parts of the signal and boosting the quiet parts. Boosting the quiet parts of the signal will very easily end up also boosting the noise floor. And whatever you do, don't make your audio look like a sound sausage. And instead of trying to make quiet sounds louder, either through manually boosting the volume or using dynamics processing, strive for maximizing the dynamic range of all imported sound sources up front and then mixing much the same way that a sculptor might approach a block of high-quality marble. Think of it as a subtractive versus an additive process. In other words, always strive to keep the noise floor as low as possible and perform mixing through attenuation. If boosting a sound also boosts its noise floor, it follows that reducing the sound source volume will reduce the noise floor and only improve the clarity of the mix. Finally, strive to do the game's dynamic mixing through what is commonly referred to as logical game mixing. Logical game mixing is when you use gameplay parameters to automate the parametric control of a sound source versus using a DSP process. As long as the logical mixing is only attenuating sound sources, it is a subtractive mixing method and more easily preserves the dynamic range of sound sources and avoids boosting the noise floor. Note that DSP-based dynamics processing still plays a huge role in certain scenarios, but strive to do it at the last step in the signal chain to avoid unwanted noise accumulation. If you must use it as part of the sound design process on your sound sources, that's totally valid. Everyone does it. Just keep in mind the issues discussed here about noise floor and noise accumulation. Remember, unwanted noise is a game audio killer. All right, so now that I've made some recommendations, I want to kind of connect it a little bit to the Unreal Audio Engine and what tools we have to help you manage this issue. So one approach to deal with this is to intentionally limit the number of sound sources you render at a given time, below what you could theoretically render based on CPU usage. In the Unreal Engine, that would mean that you set your game's project settings to a limited number of sound sources. It's a property called max channels in the audio project settings. And by using a limited number of sound sources, you can essentially create a kind of worst case scenario of noise floor accumulation. And the problem of mixing is somewhat simplified due to the smaller number of moving parts or sound sources. Then within that limited pool of sounds, you can utilize various features that allow you to control and inform the audio engine what sounds are most important to your artistic intentions. In UE4, we have a feature called sound concurrency, which allows you to group related sounds together and then mutually limit the total number of sounds that play within that group. If you're familiar with music systems, it could be like a polyphony management. So, for example, if you want to limit the total number of footsteps you hear at a given time, which is a classic issue in games, you can create a footstep concurrency group and only allow, like, for example, up to like 6 of the nearest or loudest footsteps to play at a given time. Then in scenes where there's like 50 characters walking around, which happens all the time, and they're trying to generate hundreds of footstep sounds, your game, in that case, if you try to play all those sounds, you would accumulate all that noise and all of those footsteps. Basically, you can just preempt that up front and only really play the important footstep sounds. So concurrency management in general is a super complicated topic, but that feature exists to sort of help you carve out and manage your sound sources and help things to be sort of more manageable from a mix point of view. Other tools for controlling and defining mix are the sound class and sound mix features. They work in conjunction to allow the sound designer to logically duck sounds based on game events. So, for example, you can reduce their volume or the importance or whatever. And they can happen either dynamically through a sort of passive mix process where you can say, if a given sound like an explosion plays, automatically trigger this mix, which then reduces the volumes of different other sounds in this group. And it kind of just can happen automatically. You don't even have to write any scripts. But you can also manage those mixes procedurally and logically in Blueprint if you want. So by using this logical ducking versus DSP ducking, you can basically maintain the overall signal to noise ratio of the mix while emphasizing loud sounds over quieter sounds. So we also have the ability to do dynamics processing in UE4 using submix effects. So you can still actually use compressors and things like that, but you can do it per source, but you can also do it at the submix level. And like I said, they're good for a number of applications, but I would recommend doing that sort of at the final step of a mix chain. To summarize this talk, I discussed how analog audio works and that it's infinite and continuous, and contrasted that to digital audio, where digital audio is quantized or a discretization of an analog audio signal at a given sample rate into numbers stored in a computer. The bit depth is the number of bits used to store the number, and it results in quantization noise. Quantization noise and analog noise both accumulate when mixing sounds together and need to be considered when mixing a game. We also talked about loudness perception and how to measure that using a logarithmic scale, and the different ways that that's used in audio. We then talked about some recommendations for game mixing that help you maximize dynamic range while reducing this issue of noise. In the second part of my talk, I'll cover the topics of sample rates and sound spectra and the impact that those have on game audio. So those topics are just as deep and have just as profound implications to your approach to game audio. I don't have yet a set date or place for that second talk, but just follow UnrealEngine.com and our social channels for future talks on the subject by myself or someone else on the team. It might be a future Unreal Fest, or maybe it'll be Game SoundCon or something like that. So thanks for checking out my talk. I hope it was useful for you.